The periscope trembled in Lieutenant Commander Alastair Mars's hands as the image came into focus. Something that shouldn't exist was floating directly above HMS Unbroken, and in 30 seconds, it would either save his crew or kill them all. The Mediterranean had never felt more like a tomb than it did on August 11, 1942. At a depth of 60 feet beneath the azure surface that tourists once admired, HMS Unbroken moved through the darkness like a mechanical predator, her diesel engines silenced, running on battery power that grew weaker with each passing hour. Lieutenant Commander Alastair Mars pressed his eye to the periscope, feeling the familiar cool metal against his brow. 27 years old, with the weight of 48 lives resting on every decision he made, Mars had learned that command in wartime was less about courage and more about the terrible mathematics of survival. Every choice had consequences. Every mistake had a body count. The operation was supposed to be straightforward: intercept the Italian convoy carrying supplies to Rommel's Africa Corps, sink what they could, and withdraw before the escorts could respond. Intelligence had promised them sitting ducks, slow merchant vessels with minimal protection. Intelligence, as Mars was about to discover, had been catastrophically wrong. "Captain, sonar contact bearing 270, range approximately 4,000 yards, whispered Petty Officer Jenkins, his voice barely audible even in the cramped control room. Mars rotated the periscope slowly, methodically sweeping the horizon. The Mediterranean sun was setting, casting long shadows across the water that made identification difficult. Ships could hide in those shadows, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. But what he was about to see would challenge everything he believed about honor, duty, and the nature of war itself. "Range closing, sir." "Contact speed." "Christ, sir, that's fast for a merchant vessel." Mars felt the first whisper of unease. Merchant ships didn't move at 20 knots, especially not in contested waters where speed meant nothing if you didn't have the guns to back it up. He adjusted the periscope's magnification, bringing the distant silhouette into sharper focus. The ship that emerged from the evening haze wasn't a fat-bellied freighter loaded with supplies. It was sleek, predatory, with the unmistakable profile of a heavy cruiser. And behind it, barely visible in the dying light, came another. "My God," Mars breathed. "Sir?" asked Lieutenant Haley, his second in command. Mars didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing through calculations, torpedo ranges, firing solutions, escape routes. 2 heavy cruisers meant at least 12 8-inch guns between them, not to mention secondary armament and escort destroyers that he couldn't yet see. HMS Unbroken carried 12 torpedoes, but in these waters, against those targets, he'd be lucky to get 2 shots before the destroyers found them. The rational choice was withdrawal. The right choice was almost certainly suicide. But what Mars saw next through his periscope made him question whether rationality and rightness were the same thing. Floating between the 2 cruisers, barely visible in their wake, was a small boat. Not a military vessel, a fishing boat, probably civilian. Mars adjusted the focus again, and his blood went cold. People. Dozens of them, crowded onto a vessel never meant to carry so many. Even from this distance, he could see they weren't soldiers. Women. Children. Refugees, most likely, fleeing the advancing German forces in North Africa. And the Italian cruisers weren't escorting them. They were hurting them. Mars stepped back from the periscope, his hands shaking slightly. In his 2 years of submarine command, he'd sent German ships to the bottom without hesitation. Those were military targets, legitimate enemies in a legitimate war. This was something else entirely. "Sir." Lieutenant Haley approached quietly. "Orders." Through the periscope, Mars watched the tragic procession continue. The fishing boat struggled to maintain speed, black smoke pouring from its overtaxed engine. The cruisers maintained formation around it, but their positioning wasn't protective, it was predatory. They were driving the refugees towards something, and Mars had a sick feeling he knew what it was. "Sonar, any additional contacts?" "Checking, sir." "Yes, sir." "Multiple contacts, bearing 090. Looks like a convoy, sir. Heavy escort. Mars closed his eyes. The picture was becoming clear. The Italians weren't just using refugees as human shields, they were using them as bait. The small fishing boat would reach the Allied convoy first, crying for help, for rescue. And when the British ships moved to assist, the Italian cruisers would emerge from the refugees' wake with all guns blazing. It was brilliant. It was horrific. And it was working. But Mars was about to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Take us up to periscope depth. Silent routine. Sir, if we engage those cruisers, I know the odds. Number 1. Mars's voice was steady, but inside, his mind was screaming. Engage, and HMS Unbroken would likely be destroyed. Withdraw, and a British convoy, and those refugees, would be slaughtered. But there was a third option. One that violated every rule of naval warfare, every principle he'd been taught at Dartmouth. One that might just save everyone, including his own crew. Mars returned to the periscope, studying the formation again. The two cruisers were maintaining a specific distance from the fishing boat, close enough to control its movement, far enough to avoid being damaged if it exploded. They were treating it as exactly what it was, expendable. Plot a firing solution on the leading cruiser. Set torpedoes for shallow run, 8 feet. 8 feet, sir. Haley looked puzzled. That's too shallow for a heavy cruiser. The torpedoes will pass right under, exactly. The realization hit Haley like a physical blow. Mars wasn't planning to sink the cruisers. He was planning something far more dangerous. An 8-foot depth setting would send the torpedoes directly under the cruisers' hulls without detonating. But the wakes would be visible, unmistakable. The Italian commanders would know they were under attack, would break formation to engage the submarine, and in doing so, would abandon their human shields. Sir, if they don't take the bait, they will. Mars's voice carried absolute certainty. Italian naval doctrine prioritizes fleet preservation above mission completion. They won't risk 2 heavy cruisers for a convoy raid, not when they think they're facing a submarine wolfpack. Wolfpack, sir. Mars almost smiled. 6 torpedo wakes, properly spaced, will look like multiple submarines launching a coordinated attack. They'll assume we're not alone. It was an incredible gamble. If the Italians called his bluff, HMS Unbroken would face 2 heavy cruisers with empty torpedo tubes and no chance of escape. If they didn't fall for the deception, the refugees would still be trapped, and the British convoy would still be ambushed. But if it worked, tubes 1 through 6 ready, sir. Shallow setting confirmed. Mars took one final look through the periscope. The fishing boat was barely making headway now, smoke pouring from its engine in thick, black clouds. Even from 4,000 yards, he could see people clustered on the deck, some holding children, all of them staring toward the horizon where they hoped salvation waited. The lead cruiser, Mars identified her as the Bolzano, maintained steady course and speed. Her guns were trained forward, ready to devastate the unsuspecting British convoy. Behind her, the second cruiser kept perfect formation, professional. Disciplined. Utterly confident in their tactical superiority, Mars was about to shatter that confidence. Final bearing and shoot. Fire 1. HMS Unbroken shuddered as the first torpedo left its tube. In the forward torpedo room, the crew worked with practiced efficiency, already loading the reload while the weapon raced toward its target. Fire 2. 8 seconds between shots. Just long enough for each torpedo to clear the submarine's wake before the next launched. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. In less than a minute, 6 torpedoes were running hot, straight, and normal toward the Italian formation. At 46 knots, they would reach the target area in less than 3 minutes. But what happened next would prove that even the best-laid plans could produce the most unexpected consequences. Mars kept his eye pressed to the periscope, watching the torpedo wakes draw white lines across the darkening water. At this range, with the sun setting behind them, the tracks would be clearly visible to Italian lookouts. "Sir, incoming transmission on emergency frequency," reported the radio operator. "Not now." "Sir, it's from the fishing boat." In English. Mars felt his stomach drop. "Put it on speaker." Static filled the control room, followed by a voice speaking English with a heavy accent, Greek, probably. "British submarine, please, we see your torpedo tracks. Do not attack the Italian ships. They promise to take us to safety if we cooperate. My children are aboard, please," the message repeated, growing more desperate with each transmission. Mars realized with growing horror that the refugees weren't being herded toward the British convoy as bait. They were being used as hostages to prevent exactly what he was doing. "Sir," whispered Lieutenant Haley, "if those torpedoes hit, they won't hit. 8-foot depth, remember." But Mars's voice lacked conviction. Torpedoes were mechanical devices, subject to mechanical failures. Depth controls could malfunction. And if even one torpedo ran shallow, through the periscope, he watched the Italian cruiser's reaction. Lookouts were pointing, officers were shouting, and the ship's formations were beginning to change. But they weren't breaking away from the fishing boat. They were tightening around it. The Italians had called his bluff. And now Mars faced a choice that would define not just his career, but his conscience. "Time to target, 40 seconds, reported the torpedo officer. Mars watched through the periscope as the Italian cruisers maneuvered with textbook precision. Instead of fleeing the torpedo attack, they were using the fishing boat as a shield, positioning the civilian vessel between themselves and the incoming weapons. It was tactically sound and morally monstrous. "Sir, we need to alter course," urged Lieutenant Haley. "If we stay at periscope depth when those torpedoes reach the formation, belay that." Mars's voice was ice cold. "All stop. Rig for silent running." The diesel engines fell silent, leaving only the soft hum of electric motors and the rapid breathing of 48 men who suddenly understood they were about to witness something that would change them forever. Through the periscope, Mars could see the Italian cruisers clearly now. The Bolzano and what he now identified as the Museo Attendolo, two of Italy's most modern heavy cruisers, each carrying nearly 1,000 men. Professional sailors following orders, just like his own crew. The fishing boat wallowed between them, its human cargo pressed against the railings, some waving desperately toward HMS Unbroken's periscope. Children. Mars could see children. 10 seconds to impact. And Mars was about to learn that honor and duty sometimes demanded the impossible. 5 seconds, whispered the torpedo officer. Mars held his breath, pressing his eye so hard against the periscope that he could feel the metal ring cutting into his skin. Everything depended on the depth control mechanisms in 6 torpedoes, devices he'd serviced himself but had never tested under these exact conditions. The first torpedo wake passed under the Bolzano's bow, exactly as planned. Then the second, and the third. Mars felt a moment of relief. The shallow setting was holding. Then he saw the fourth torpedo's wake suddenly disappear. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered in the control room. The torpedo had sunk. Whether due to mechanical failure or damage from the previous launch, it was now running deep, too deep to threaten the cruisers, but shallow enough to pass directly under the fishing boat. Mars watched in fascination and horror as the fishing boat lurched violently to port, then began to settle by the stern. The torpedo hadn't detonated, but its passing had damaged the hull, opened seams that were now flooding the overloaded vessel. People began jumping into the water. Not in panic, but with the desperate efficiency of those who knew their ship was sinking and had maybe minutes to get clear. And that's when Mars saw something through his periscope that would question everything he thought he knew about his enemies. The Italian cruisers could have used the sinking fishing boat as cover for their withdrawal. Could have abandoned the refugees to pursue HMS Unbroken. Could have followed doctrine and preserved their ships at all costs. Instead, they did something that Mars had not anticipated, something that challenged every assumption he'd made about his enemies. They stopped. The Bolzano and Museo Attendolo came to full stop, and within minutes, boats were being lowered from their davits. Italian sailors, the same men who moments before had been preparing to ambush a British convoy, were now risking their own ships to rescue civilians. Mars watched through the periscope as boat after boat pulled alongside the sinking fishing vessel. Italian sailors hauled children out of the water, passed blankets to shivering women, organized the rescue with the same efficiency they'd shown in tactical maneuvers. "Sir." Lieutenant Haley's voice was barely audible. "Orders." Mars didn't answer. He couldn't answer. Everything he'd been taught about submarine warfare, about enemy psychology, about the nature of war itself, was being rewritten in front of his eyes. The Italian cruisers were sitting ducks. Dead in the water, focused on rescue operations, completely vulnerable to torpedo attack. A single properly aimed spread would send both ships to the bottom, eliminating two major threats to Allied shipping in the Mediterranean. It would also kill 1,000 Italian sailors and hundreds of refugees. But Mars was about to make a decision that would define him not as a submarine commander, but as a human being. "Torpedo room, prepare to surface," Mars ordered quietly. "Sir." Haley looked stunned. "Surface?" "In sight of two enemy cruisers. We're going to help with the rescue." The control room fell silent except for the soft hum of electrical systems. Every man aboard HMS Unbroken understood the implications. Surfacing in sight of enemy warships was suicide. But allowing hundreds of civilians to drown while they watched through a periscope might be something worse. "Sir," the radio operator spoke up, "incoming transmission from the Italian flagship." "Put it on speaker." Static filled the compartment, followed by a voice speaking English with an educated accent, probably the cruiser's captain. "British submarine, we know you are watching. We have people in the water. Women and children. We request temporary ceasefire for humanitarian rescue. You have my word as an officer that we will not engage your vessel if you approach to assist." Mars stepped back from the periscope, his mind racing. The Italian captain was offering a ceasefire, in the middle of a war, surrounded by his enemies, with his ships completely vulnerable. It was either an act of remarkable courage or an incredibly sophisticated trap. And Mars was about to bet 48 lives on his ability to tell the difference. "All hands, prepare to surface," Mars announced over the intercom. "We are approaching Italian vessels under temporary ceasefire for humanitarian rescue. All weapons will remain secured unless specifically ordered otherwise." He could feel the tension throughout the submarine as his crew processed the unprecedented situation. In 2 years of war, none of them had ever surfaced in sight of enemy warships except to surrender. "Sir," whispered Lieutenant Haley, "if this is a trap, then we die helping people instead of hiding from them." Mars's voice carried quiet conviction. "Take her up." HMS Unbroken began her ascent, rising from the dark safety of the depths toward the dangerous uncertainty of the surface. As the submarine breached, water cascaded from her conning tower, and Mars climbed to the bridge with his heart hammering against his ribs. The scene that greeted him was unlike anything in his naval training. 2 Italian heavy cruisers, their guns trained harmlessly skyward, surrounded by lifeboats and floating debris. Italian sailors worked frantically to pull survivors from the water while their officers maintained strict discipline to prevent panic, and standing on the bridge of the Bolzano, clearly visible through binoculars, was an Italian naval officer watching HMS Unbroken surface with what appeared to be a mixture of professional respect and human gratitude. But what Mars saw next would challenge his understanding of warfare forever. "Signal from the Italian flagship," reported the signalman. "They're directing us to coordinate rescue operations on the port side of the sinking vessel." Mars raised his binoculars, studying the Italian captain's face. The man was young, probably not much older than himself, with the weathered features of someone who'd spent years at sea. But what struck Mars most was the expression in his eyes, not the cold calculation of a military professional, but the desperate concern of someone watching people die. "All hands on deck," Mars ordered. "Prepare to take on survivors." Within minutes, HMS Unbroken's crew was working alongside their Italian counterparts in a surreal scene of cooperation. British and Italian sailors passed rope to drowning civilians, hauled children onto deck, and distributed emergency supplies with the efficiency of men who understood that some things transcended nationality. Mars found himself working directly alongside an Italian petty officer, both men hauling an elderly Greek fisherman onto the submarine's deck. The Italian sailor nodded respectfully and said in broken English, "Thank you, Captain. This is good." "Yes," Mars replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. "This is good." For 20 minutes, enemies became rescuers. For 20 minutes, the Mediterranean was a sea of cooperation rather than conflict. For 20 minutes, Mars experienced what war could be if humanity overcame politics. And then reality intruded in the form of aircraft engines approaching from the north. "Aircraft approaching," shouted the lookout. "Multiple contacts, bearing 010. Mars raised his binoculars toward the sound. 3 aircraft, flying low and fast. Even at this distance, he could see they weren't Italian, the distinctive silhouette of German Junkers Ju-88s, probably on patrol from Sicily. The temporary ceasefire was about to become irrelevant. "Signal from Italian flagship," the signalman reported urgently. Message reads, "German aircraft. We resume hostilities in 5 minutes. Suggest you submerge now." Mars felt a sick twist in his stomach. The Italian captain was warning him, giving HMS Unbroken time to escape before the German aircraft arrived and forced a return to combat. It was an act of honor that transcended the temporary alliance of rescue operations. "All hands, prepare to dive," Mars ordered. "Get those survivors below." But as HMS Unbroken's crew rushed to secure the rescued civilians and prepare for emergency submersion, Mars realized they faced an impossible situation. They'd taken aboard 37 survivors, Greek fishermen, women, children, and the submarine's life support systems weren't designed for that many additional people. Submerging now would likely kill the people they'd just saved. "Sir," Lieutenant Haley approached quietly, "life support calculations. We can maintain atmosphere for maybe 6 hours with this many people aboard." After that, Mars understood. After that, they'd face a choice between surfacing into combat or slowly suffocating underwater. The German aircraft were approaching rapidly, and the Italian cruisers were already beginning to maneuver into combat formation. In minutes, this area would become a battlefield. "Signal to Italian flagship," Mars ordered. "Request continued ceasefire for transfer of survivors." "Sir, they can't. Send the signal." The response came immediately, "Impossible. German aircraft will arrive in 3 minutes. Suggest you transfer survivors to us and depart immediately." Mars looked at the 37 people crowded onto HMS Unbroken's deck. Greek fishermen who'd been fleeing German occupation. Women who'd lost everything but their children. Children who'd lost everything but their mothers. Transferring them to the Italian cruisers would save their lives. It would also mean handing civilians over to Axis forces, probably for internment or worse. And Mars was about to make the most difficult decision of his command. "Sir, German aircraft 2 minutes out," reported the lookout. "They're definitely Ju-88s, and they're coming in low." Mars could see the aircraft clearly now, 3 dark shapes skimming across the Mediterranean at wave height. The pilots would spot the surface vessels any second, and when they did, the ceasefire would end in a hail of bombs and machine gun fire. The Italian cruiser captain was signaling frantically, obviously urging HMS Unbroken to submerge while she still could. But Mars stood frozen on the bridge, staring at the 37 civilians who were depending on him for their lives. "Captain," said a quiet voice beside him. "Captain, please." Mars turned to see an elderly Greek man, one of the fishermen they'd pulled from the water. The man's clothes were soaked, his face weathered by decades at sea, but his eyes held unmistakable dignity. "Captain, we understand. You must save your ship, your men. We go to Italian ship now. Better prison than death for everyone." The old fisherman's English was broken, but his meaning was clear. He was offering to sacrifice his freedom, and that of his family, to save the submarine and its crew. Mars felt something break inside his chest. These people had already lost everything to war. Now they were willing to sacrifice their liberty to save the men who'd rescued them. But Mars was about to discover that sometimes honor demands the impossible. "Belay that," Mars said firmly. "No one transfers to the Italian ships. We're taking everyone with us." "Sir," Lieutenant Haley protested quietly, "the life support will last long enough." Mars's voice carried absolute conviction, even though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "Clear the bridge. Emergency dive in 60 seconds." As HMS Unbroken's crew rushed to secure the last of the survivors below deck, Mars took one final look at the Italian cruisers. On the bridge of the Bolzano, the Italian captain raised his hand in a brief salute, a gesture of respect between professional naval officers who understood the weight of command. Mars returned the salute, then dropped through the conning tower hatch as HMS Unbroken began her emergency dive. 45 feet and level off, he ordered. Silent running. German aircraft overhead in 30 seconds. The submarine slipped beneath the surface just as the first junkers roared overhead. Through the hull, Mars could hear the aircraft engines and, moments later, the distinctive whistle of falling bombs. The ceasefire was over. The war had resumed. And HMS Unbroken was carrying 37 civilians into battle. The first depth charges exploded 300 yards to starboard, their detonations rolling through the water like underwater thunder. HMS Unbroken shuddered under the pressure waves, but held steady at 45 feet. Mars moved through the submarine's cramped compartments, checking on the civilians they'd rescued. The Greek fishermen stood quietly in whatever spaces they could find, understanding instinctively that noise could kill everyone aboard. The women clutched their children, whispering soft reassurances in voices barely audible over the submarine's mechanical sounds. In the forward torpedo room, an 8-year-old Greek girl sat on an ammunition locker, staring wide-eyed at the massive brass torpedoes surrounding her. Mars knelt beside her, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "What's your name?" he asked in the few words of Greek he'd learned. "Maria," she whispered. "It's going to be all right, Maria. We're going to get you somewhere safe." She nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of his promise. But Mars was about to discover that keeping that promise would require breaking every rule of submarine warfare. "Sir," the sonar operator reported quietly, "surface ships moving overhead. Sounds like the Italian cruisers engaging the German aircraft." Through the hull, Mars could hear the distant rumble of anti-aircraft guns. The battle he'd avoided by submerging was raging directly above them, and HMS Unbroken was trapped beneath it. "Life support status?" Mars asked Lieutenant Haley. "Marginal, sir. With this many people aboard, we're consuming oxygen faster than the scrubbers can process CO2. Maybe 4 hours before it becomes critical." 4 hours. Mars did the calculations quickly. At their current speed and depth, they could reach the Allied-controlled waters near Gibraltar in 18 hours. They needed to surface for air long before that, which meant surfacing into potentially hostile waters. "Sir," the radio operator whispered, "incoming transmission on emergency frequency. Very weak signal. Put it on speaker, lowest volume." Static filled the control room, followed by a faint voice speaking English. "Any Allied submarine in grid reference Mike 7. This is HMS Proteus. We are proceeding to assist with rescue operations. Acknowledge if you receive." Mars felt a surge of hope. HMS Proteus was another T-class submarine, commanded by his friend John Stevens. If Proteus was in the area, they might be able to transfer the civilians to a ship better equipped to handle them. But responding to the transmission would reveal their position to every listening post in the Mediterranean. "Sir," urged Lieutenant Haley, "we should respond. Proteus could take some of the survivors." Mars hesitated. Revealing HMS Unbroken's position and status would help the civilians, but it would also inform German and Italian forces that a British submarine was operating in their waters. Future operations would be compromised. Lives would be lost. The utilitarian calculus was clear: sacrifice 37 civilian lives to preserve the submarine's operational effectiveness and save potentially hundreds of Allied lives in future operations. But Mars looked at Maria, still sitting quietly on the torpedo casing, and realized that utilitarian calculus felt like moral cowardice. Radio, prepare to transmit. Low power, burst transmission. Sir, if the Germans triangulate, they won't have time. Send, Proteus, this is unbroken. Have civilian survivors aboard. Request rendezvous for transfer. Will transmit coordinates on your acknowledgement. The transmission would save the civilians' lives. It might also doom HMS Unbroken and her crew. The response from HMS Proteus came within minutes. Unbroken, understood. Proceeding to rendezvous point Delta 7. ETA 40 minutes. Maintain current depth and heading. Mars plotted the course quickly. Rendezvous point Delta 7 was a predetermined location used for submarine emergencies, a patch of deep water 50 miles southeast of Malta, hopefully far enough from Axis patrol routes to allow a safe surface meeting. New course 270, Mars ordered. Increase speed to 8 knots. HMS Unbroken turned toward the rendezvous, carrying her unusual cargo through the dark Mediterranean waters. In the cramped compartments, British sailors shared their emergency rations with Greek civilians while children played quiet games with submarine equipment that their parents prayed would never have to be used in anger. Sir, the sonar operator reported, multiple surface contacts to the north. High-speed screws, probably destroyers. Mars moved to the sonar station, listening to the distinctive sound patterns through the operator's headphones. Italian destroyers, he was certain, fast, agile ships perfectly designed for hunting submarines. Range and bearing. Approximately 8,000 yards, bearing 010. There, sir, they're on a search pattern. Moving in expanding circles. Mars felt his stomach tighten. The destroyers were hunting for HMS Unbroken, probably alerted by their earlier surface contact with the cruisers. And they were between the submarine and the rendezvous point. But Mars was about to attempt something that violated every principle of submarine tactics. Plot an intercept course for the destroyers, Mars ordered. Sir. Lieutenant Haley looked stunned. Intercept. They're between us and Proteus. We can't go around them, not with 40 minutes until rendezvous. So we go through them. It was insane. Submarine doctrine called for avoiding destroyers at all costs. Their sonar equipment and depth charges made them the most dangerous anti-submarining platforms afloat. Deliberately moving toward them was suicide, but conventional submarine doctrine didn't account for 37 civilians running out of air. Set depth to 100 feet, Mars ordered. Silent running. We're going to pass directly under their search pattern. Sir, if they detect us, they won't. Italian destroyers use older sonar equipment, and will be running too deep for their standard search patterns. Mars hoped he sounded more confident than he felt. Italian anti-submarine warfare had improved significantly since 1940, and newer destroyers carried equipment capable of detecting submarines at greater depths, but hope was all he had. As HMS Unbroken descended toward the approaching destroyers, Mars realized he was betting 48 lives on his understanding of enemy capabilities. At 100 feet depth, HMS Unbroken moved through the water like a mechanical ghost. Every unnecessary system had been shut down, every sound dampened, every movement minimized. The submarine's crew worked in practiced silence while the Greek civilians watched with growing understanding of their precarious situation. Contact bearing 090, range 3,000 yards and closing, whispered the sonar operator. Mars could hear the destroyer's screws through the hull now, the distinctive fast chop-chop-chop of high-speed propellers cutting through water. Italian destroyers typically carried crews of 200 men, depth charge throwers, and enough firepower to sink a submarine with a single accurate pattern. Second contact, bearing 120, range 4,000 yards. 2 destroyers, moving in coordinated search pattern. Mars studied their positions on the plotting table, calculating courses and speeds with the precision of a man whose life depended on mathematical accuracy. "They're running parallel search tracks," he told Lieutenant Haley quietly. "If we maintain current course and speed, we'll pass between them with maybe 500 yards clearance on each side." "That's cutting it close, sir." "Yes, it is." In the forward torpedo room, little Maria had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder. The Greek woman watched Mars with eyes that held no accusation, only acceptance. She understood, as all refugees understand, that survival often depends on the decisions of strangers. But as HMS Unbroken approached the gap between the destroyers, Mars heard something that made his blood freeze. "Sir," the sonar operator's voice was barely audible, "third contact. Dead ahead, range 2,000 yards. Moving slowly." Mars pressed the headphones to his ears, listening to the new sound pattern. Slow, methodical engine beats. Not a destroyer, something else. "It's a patrol vessel, sir. Probably a corvette, running search pattern between the destroyers." The trap was more sophisticated than Mars had realized. The 2 destroyers weren't just searching, they were driving submarines toward a third vessel positioned to detect anything trying to pass between them. HMS Unbroken was heading directly into an anti-submarine ambush. "Sir, recommend we abort the intercept," whispered Lieutenant Haley. "Surface now, fight our way out." Mars considered the option. Surface action would give them a chance against 1 or 2 destroyers, but it would also expose the civilians to direct fire. And with 3 enemy vessels, the odds of escape were minimal. Negative. "We continue as planned." "Sir, we continue as planned, number 1. Because Mars had just realized that sometimes the only way through hell is straight ahead. HMS Unbroken moved through the water at minimum speed, every man aboard holding his breath as the submarine threaded between 3 enemy vessels. The destroyer to port was close enough that Mars could hear depth charges being moved on deck, the distinctive metallic clanging of anti-submarining weapons being prepared for use. "Range to port contact, 600 yards, whispered the sonar operator. 600 yards. Close enough to read the ship's number if they were on the surface. Close enough to hear individual voices if the crew was being careless with sound discipline. In the submarine's cramped compartments, 37 Greek civilians waited in absolute silence. Even the children seemed to understand that their lives depended on mechanical quietness, on becoming invisible to the electronic ears searching for them. "Range to starboard contact, 700 yards. The destroyer to starboard was slightly more distant, but still close enough to detect HMS Unbroken if her sonar operators were competent. Mars found himself mentally cataloging everything he knew about Italian destroyer crews, their training, their equipment, their standard procedures. Italian anti-submarining doctrine called for active sonar sweeps every 30 seconds during search operations. If the timing held, HMS Unbroken would pass through the gap between sweeps, undetected in the electronic blind spot. If the timing held. But as they approached the narrowest part of the gap, Mars heard the one sound that submarine commanders feared most. Ping. The sharp, metallic sound of active sonar striking HMS Unbroken's hull. Ping. Again, closer this time, the corvette ahead had detected something, not a clear contact, but an anomaly worth investigating. In 30 seconds, she would turn toward them with full sonar power, and the game would be over. "Sir," Lieutenant Haley's voice was barely audible. "Orders." Mars stared at the plotting table, calculating distances, speeds, detection probabilities. 30 seconds to clear the gap. 29. 28. The ping came again, stronger this time. Someone aboard the corvette was getting suspicious. And Mars was about to make a decision that would either save his ship or destroy it. "All ahead 1/3, Mars ordered quietly. "Increase speed to 6 knots. "Sir, the noise will be masked by the destroyer's engines." They're running at high speed. We'll hide in their acoustic shadow. It was a calculated risk. The increased speed would get them through the gap faster, but it would also generate more noise. If the Italian sonar operators were good enough to distinguish submarine sounds from destroyer noise, HMS Unbroken would be dead in the water. 20 seconds. 15. 10. The corvette's sonar ping came one final time, but weaker now. HMS Unbroken was pulling away from the search pattern, sliding into the deeper water beyond the anti-submarine trap. 5 seconds. Clear. Sir, the sonar operator reported with obvious relief, all contacts bearing increasing. We're through. Mars felt the tension drain from his shoulders, but he maintained silent running for another 10 minutes before allowing normal operations to resume. Only when they were well clear of the Italian search pattern did he permit himself a moment of satisfaction. But their troubles were far from over. Ahead lay the rendezvous with HMS Proteus, and the Mediterranean was full of eyes. The rendezvous point lay in a patch of deep water where the Mediterranean abruptly plunged from 200 meters to over 1,000. It was a place where submarines could disappear quickly if surface threats appeared, and where the acoustic properties of the water made detection difficult. HMS Proteus was waiting when they arrived. Mars raised the periscope carefully, scanning the surface for threats before committing to the dangerous evolution of surfacing in daylight. The Mediterranean sparkled under afternoon sun, deceptively peaceful, with no sign of patrol aircraft or surface vessels. Surface the boat, Mars ordered. HMS Unbroken breached like a mechanical whale, water cascading from her ballast tanks as she settled into surface trim. 100 yards away, HMS Proteus waited with her own crew standing by to receive the Greek civilians. Mars climbed to the bridge, breathing fresh air for the first time in hours. Across the gap between submarines, he could see Commander John Stevens, his classmate from Dartmouth, his friend since their days as midshipman. Alastair. Stevens called across the water. What the devil have you been up to? Humanitarian rescue, Mars replied with a wry smile. We have 37 Greek civilians aboard. Refugees from the Italian advance. Stevens' expression grew serious. Understood. We can take them. But we'll need to transfer quickly. German reconnaissance flights patrol this area every 2 hours. The transfer began immediately. HMS Unbroken's crew organized the civilians into small groups while Proteus maneuvered alongside with practiced skill. Lines were passed between the submarines, and the delicate process of moving people from one moving vessel to another commenced. But as Mars watched the Greek families climb across to safety, he realized the morning's events had changed something fundamental about his understanding of war. Little Maria was among the last to transfer. As her mother helped her across the gap between submarines, the 8-year-old girl looked back at Mars and spoke in careful English. "Thank you, Captain. I will remember." Then she was gone, safe aboard HMS Proteus with the other survivors. All civilians transferred, reported Lieutenant Haley. Mars nodded, but found himself reluctant to give the order to submerge. The morning's events had revealed something about warfare that his training at Dartmouth had never addressed, that enemies could show honor, that humanity could transcend nationality, that the most important victories weren't always measured in ships sunk or territories captured. Signal from Proteus, the signalman reported. Safe travels, old friend. See you in Gibraltar. Mars raised his hand in farewell as HMS Proteus began to submerge, carrying the Greek civilians toward safety. Then he gave the order that would take HMS Unbroken back into the depths, back into the war. But he was no longer the same submarine commander who had raised his periscope that morning. 3 days later, HMS Unbroken was patrolling the waters off Cape Spartivento when Mars received a radio transmission that would complete his transformation. Unbroken, this is Malta Command. Intelligence reports indicate Italian heavy cruisers Bolzano and Museo Attendolo were severely damaged in engagement with German aircraft following your encounter. Both vessels currently in Taranto for extensive repairs. Well done. Mars stared at the message, understanding its implications. The Italian cruisers that had participated in the civilian rescue had been attacked by their own German allies, punishment, perhaps, for showing mercy to refugees and engaging in humanitarian ceasefire with a British submarine. The irony was bitter. The Italians' moment of humanity had cost them 2 major warships. "Sir." Lieutenant Haley approached quietly. "New patrol orders from Malta Command." Mars read the orders mechanically. Another convoy to intercept, another tactical situation to resolve. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying the image of Italian sailors risking their lives to rescue civilians, of an enemy captain offering ceasefire for humanitarian reasons. That evening, as HMS Unbroken ran submerged through the dark Mediterranean, Mars made an entry in his personal log that would never appear in official records. August 14, 1942. Today I learned that war is not a matter of good versus evil, but of human beings trapped in circumstances beyond their control. The Italians who rescued civilians yesterday were the same men who would have killed us without hesitation in combat today. This is not a contradiction, it is simply war. I have spent 2 years believing that my enemies were fundamentally different from my crew and myself. Today I discovered they are fundamentally the same. They have families, consciences, codes of honor. They can show mercy even when mercy is militarily disadvantageous. This knowledge makes command both easier and infinitely more difficult. Easier because I now understand my opponents as human beings rather than monsters. More difficult because killing human beings requires different justification than killing monsters. The war will continue. Ships will sink, men will die, nations will struggle for victory. But I will never again see the enemy as anything less than fellow humans caught in the machinery of history. Mars closed the log and returned to the bridge, where HMS Unbroken continued her patrol through waters that would never look the same again. 2 weeks after the civilian rescue, Mars received intelligence about a major Italian convoy departing Brindisi, 12 merchant vessels carrying supplies to Rommel's Africa Corps, escorted by destroyers and, according to reconnaissance reports, the newly repaired heavy cruiser Bolzano, the same ship whose crew had helped rescue Greek civilians. Mars studied the intelligence reports with professional detachment, calculating intercept courses and torpedo firing solutions with the mechanical precision that submarine warfare demanded. But beneath the tactical analysis, he felt the weight of personal knowledge. He knew the Italian captain's face, had witnessed his honor, understood his humanity. And in 18 hours, professional duty would require Mars to attempt killing him. "Sir," Lieutenant Haley interrupted his thoughts, "the plotting team has a preliminary intercept course. We can reach the convoy route by 0400 tomorrow." "Very good, number 1. Set course 210, speed 12 knots. HMS Unbroken turned toward her rendezvous with destiny, carrying her crew and commander toward an encounter that would test everything Mars had learned about honor, duty, and the terrible mathematics of war. But as the submarine approached its target, Mars was about to discover that understanding your enemy's humanity doesn't make killing him any easier, it just makes it necessary. The convoy appeared on the horizon at dawn, exactly where intelligence had predicted. 12 fat merchant vessels laden with supplies for the German army, escorted by 4 destroyers and the unmistakable silhouette of the Bolzano. Mars raised the periscope, studying the formation with professional interest. The Italians had learned from previous submarine attacks. Their escort pattern was tight, disciplined, with destroyers positioned to provide overlapping sonar coverage, but Mars had learned too. From the morning of the civilian rescue, he understood that his opponents were professionals who would fight with skill and courage, but who could also be counted upon to honor the traditions of naval warfare. "Range to lead merchant vessel, 6,000 yards, reported the torpedo officer. Mars made his final observations through the periscope. The convoy was well organized, the escorts alert and competent. It would be a difficult attack, with significant risk to HMS Unbroken, but it was also necessary. Those merchant ships carried ammunition that would kill British soldiers in North Africa, fuel that would extend Rommel's reach across the desert, supplies that could prolong the war and cost thousands of Allied lives. The personal knowledge Mars had gained of Italian honor didn't change the strategic necessity of the attack. It only made that necessity more profound. "Make ready tubes 1 through 6, Mars ordered. "We're going in." HMS Unbroken's attack on the Italian convoy was devastating and precise. 3 merchant vessels sunk, the convoy scattered, supplies meant for Rommel's army resting on the Mediterranean floor. The Bolzano fought with professional competence before withdrawing with her remaining charges, her captain executing a textbook defensive action that saved most of the convoy while minimizing his own losses. Mars never learned whether the Italian captain survived the war. He never discovered if their brief cooperation during the civilian rescue had any lasting impact on either man's conduct. He never found out what happened to little Maria and the other Greek refugees, but he carried the memory of that morning, the periscope image that made him question everything, for the rest of his career. It shaped his understanding of command, of honor, of the difference between necessary violence and meaningless brutality. Years later, when military historians asked Mars about his most significant action as a submarine commander, he never mentioned the convoy attacks or the tonnage sunk. He talked instead about a morning when enemies became rescuers, when honor transcended nationality, when he learned that the most important questions in war are not tactical but moral. What Alastair Mars saw through his periscope that August morning made him question everything he thought he knew about warfare. The answers he found made him a better commander and, perhaps more importantly, a better man. The Mediterranean kept its secrets, as oceans always do. But the lessons learned in those deep waters echoed through the rest of Mars's career, reminding him that even in the machinery of total war, humanity could survive, scarred, complicated, morally ambiguous, but ultimately intact. Some victories are measured in ships sunk and territories captured. Others are measured in moments when enemies choose mercy over expedience, when honor trumps tactics, when the humanity of war proves stronger than its machinery. Mars had witnessed both kinds of victory. He understood that both were necessary, and that the weight of command lay in knowing the difference. The end. This story is based on the historical service of Lieutenant Commander Alastair Mars, who commanded HMS Unbroken during operations in the Mediterranean from 1941 to 1943, including participation in Operation Pedestal. While the specific events described are fictional, they reflect the moral complexities and human dimensions of submarine warfare during World War II.